June 7, 1944, 6:43 a.m., 3 kilometers inland from Utah Beach, Normandy. Oberst Fritz Hartmann crouched behind a shattered stone wall, watching through his field glasses as American paratroopers moved through the morning mist. The 352nd Infantry Division had been defending the Bocage country for 36 hours since the invasion began. Hartmann had fought Americans in North Africa. He knew what to expect: adequate equipment, cautious tactics, predictable doctrine. What he observed through those binoculars contradicted everything the Wehrmacht had taught him about American fighting spirit. 12 paratroopers, isolated, surrounded, cut off from their units, were attacking a German strongpoint defended by 43 men with machine guns and mortars. No artillery support, no tanks, no reinforcements visible. They were attacking anyway. In the next 72 hours, Hartmann would discover why Wehrmacht intelligence reports would eventually classify US Airborne divisions as the most dangerous enemy forces in Western Europe. This is that story. If stories of courage and ingenuity move you, please like and subscribe. Every subscription helps us honor the memories of those who served. Fritz Hartmann was born in 1908 in Bremen, son of a Great War veteran who had fought at Verdun. He joined the Reichswehr in 1928, rising through peacetime ranks as a professional infantry officer. By 1944, he commanded the 3rd Battalion, 352nd Infantry Division, veteran troops who had survived the Eastern Front before being transferred west for rest and refitting in France. The 352nd Infantry Division was real. Activated in November 1943, it defended the Normandy coast on D-Day, facing the American V Corps at Omaha Beach and the 101st Airborne Division inland. The division consisted of experienced soldiers mixed with younger conscripts positioned in the hedgerow country behind the invasion beaches. Hartmann had studied American tactics in Wehrmacht intelligence briefings throughout May 1944. The assessments were consistent. American soldiers were well equipped but poorly motivated, dependent on overwhelming firepower, quick to surrender when isolated. German doctrine emphasized that Americans preferred defensive positions and avoided close combat. The 101st Airborne Division dropped into Normandy early on June 6, 1944. 6,600 paratroopers scattered across 50 square kilometers of Bocage country. Many landed miles from their drop zones. Units were fragmented, isolated, cut off from command structure. Standard military doctrine suggested such dispersed forces would be unable to conduct effective operations. The 101st did not follow standard doctrine. Hartmann's first encounter with American paratroopers occurred 37 hours after the invasion began. His battalion had established defensive positions in the village of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, controlling a causeway the Americans needed to link Utah Beach with inland forces. Wehrmacht intelligence estimated it would take the disorganized American airborne forces at least a week to mount a coordinated attack. They were catastrophically wrong. June 7, 1944. Morning fog still clung to the hedgerows. Hartmann's battalion occupied strong defensive positions. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Mortars were registered on likely avenues of attack. His men had ammunition, food, and clear fields of fire. The isolated American paratroopers they'd encountered were scattered, disorganized, moving in small groups trying to find their units. Standard procedure was to wait. Let the confused Americans wander into established kill zones. Pick them off piecemeal. Wehrmacht doctrine was clear. Fragmented enemy forces would attempt to consolidate before attacking fortified positions. The Americans didn't consolidate. They attacked immediately. 6:47 a.m. Hartmann watched through binoculars as 12 paratroopers, he counted them twice to be certain, approached the German strongpoint from the south. The position held a full platoon, 43 men, 3 MG-42 machine guns, 2 80mm mortars, excellent cover in a farmhouse complex. Oberst Heinrich Meyer commanded that strong point. Hartmann had served with Meyer since 1941. Competent, experienced, steady under fire. The type of officer you wanted defending a critical position. The 12 Americans stopped at the tree line, 400 meters from the farmhouse. Hartmann expected them to scout the position, pull back, report to headquarters, wait for reinforcements. Instead, at 6:51 a.m., they fixed bayonets and charged. No preparatory fire, no covering element providing suppression. No smoke to conceal their movement. 12 men running directly at a defended position held by 43. Hartmann thought they were insane. Meyer's machine guns opened fire at 300 meters. Standard defensive procedure. Controlled bursts, conserve ammunition, wait for targets to close. 3 Americans fell in the first 10 seconds. The remaining 9 kept coming. At 200 meters, Meyer's mortars fired. 2 more Americans went down. The survivors didn't stop, didn't take cover, didn't retreat. At 100 meters, 5 Americans were still advancing, now throwing grenades, firing their rifles from the hip, screaming something Hartmann couldn't make out from his observation post. They reached the farmhouse. What happened next took 4 minutes. Hartmann heard the sounds: rifle fire, grenades, shouting in English and German, more grenades. When silence returned, the farmhouse was burning. Meyer was dead. 38 of his men were dead or wounded. 5 American paratroopers walked away, wounded, exhausted, down to their last ammunition, but walking. Hartmann lowered his binoculars. His hands, for the first time since 1941, were shaking. That night, Hartmann met with his company commanders in a command post 3 kilometers from Saint-Côme-du-Mont. Maps spread across a wooden table showed American positions marked with the standard blue symbols Wehrmacht intelligence used for enemy forces. Except these Americans weren't behaving according to any intelligence assessment Hartmann had studied. They should be consolidating, Hauptmann Klaus Richter said, pointing to clusters of map symbols. They've been scattered for 36 hours. Standard doctrine says they'll pull back, reorganize, establish a defensive perimeter. Standard doctrine, Hartmann said quietly, doesn't explain what happened to Meyer's position this morning. The officers fell silent. They'd all heard the report. 12 Americans attacking 43 Germans in a fortified position. 5 Americans walking away victorious. Hartmann had spent the afternoon analyzing every engagement his battalion had witnessed since D-Day. 17 separate contacts with American paratroopers. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. US Airborne forces attacked immediately upon contact, regardless of numerical disadvantage. They showed no concern for casualties or tactical probability. When surrounded or isolated, they became more aggressive, not less. They refused surrender even when logic dictated it was the only rational choice. In North Africa, Hartmann said, pulling out his combat diary from 1943, when we surrounded American positions at Kasserine Pass, they surrendered after brief resistance. When we cut off British positions at Gazala, they withdrew under cover of darkness. Both responses were tactically sound. He looked at his officers. These paratroopers fight differently. They fight as if being surrounded makes them stronger. Hauptmann Richter nodded slowly. The isolated groups we've encountered, they don't try to evade. They attack toward the sound of fighting, like they're seeking contact. Because they are, Hartmann realized. They dropped scattered intentionally. The disorganization isn't a problem to be solved. It's their tactical method. Every isolated group becomes an independent attack force. They don't need supply lines or reinforcements or clear command structure. They need targets. This contradicted everything Wehrmacht doctrine taught about combined arms warfare, supply logistics, and unit cohesion. It also explained why Hartmann's battalion, despite superior numbers and defensive positions, was losing ground. At 11 p.m., Hartmann drafted a report for division headquarters. American airborne forces do not follow conventional infantry doctrine. Recommend treating them as elite assault troops, comparable to Soviet Guards rifle divisions or British commandos. Standard engagement protocols insufficient. These soldiers attack when surrounded, fight harder when isolated, and demonstrate fanaticism inconsistent with previous assessments of American morale. Division headquarters filed the report but took no immediate action. Wehrmacht intelligence still classified American forces as inferior to German troops in combat effectiveness. Hartmann knew better. He'd seen Meyer's farmhouse. The next morning, June 8th, his battalion would face 101st Airborne Forces again. This time, Hartmann wouldn't rely on doctrine. He would treat them like the demons they fought like. June 8, 1944, 5:34 a.m. Dawn broke cold over Saint-Côme-du-Mont. Hartmann positioned his forces according to revised tactics. Instead of static defensive positions, he established mobile reaction teams. Instead of waiting for Americans to attack, he planned to strike first at dawn, catch the paratroopers before they could organize their next assault. Intelligence reports indicated approximately 200 American paratroopers had consolidated in the hedgerows south of the village. Hartmann commanded 400 men, 2-to-1 numerical advantage. Defensive terrain. Supporting mortars. Standard Wehrmacht doctrine predicted victory within 2 hours. At 5:41 a.m., Hartmann's lead company advanced through morning mist toward American positions. The plan was simple: locate enemy concentrations, fix them with fire, maneuver around flanks, force withdrawal. At 5:47 a.m., 6 kilometers away, the 101st Airborne Division was executing a different plan. They weren't waiting to be attacked, they were already moving. Hartmann's lead company encountered American forces at 5:52 a.m., but not where intelligence predicted. The paratroopers weren't defending the southern hedgerows. They were attacking from the west, moving through terrain Wehrmacht planners had considered impassable. The Americans had found a gap in German defensive lines that Hartmann didn't know existed. 5:52 a.m. Hartmann's radio crackled. Contact! American forces, company strength, attacking from grid 1247. They're coming through the flooded area. They're wading through water under fire. Hartmann grabbed his map. Grid 1247 was marked as impassable terrain, waist-deep water, no cover, perfect kill zone. No rational commander would send troops through it. The Americans were waist-deep in water, advancing anyway. Standard doctrine said, establish firing positions on the water's edge, create interlocking fields of fire, wait for Americans to realize the approach was suicidal, and withdraw. Hartmann had learned yesterday that American paratroopers didn't withdraw. Second Company, move immediately to grid 1247, he ordered. Don't wait for them to reach the shore. Hit them in the water with everything: machine guns, mortars, rifles, maximum volume. Don't let them establish any foothold. If they were coming through hell, make hell worse. His troops reached the water's edge at 5:58 a.m. 3 MG-42 machine guns set up in overlapping positions. Mortars registered on the water itself. Riflemen took positions behind a stone wall. The Americans were 200 meters out, moving in extended line formation through chest-deep water. Hartmann counted approximately 80 men, a full company, laden with weapons and equipment, wading through flooded fields in full view of German positions. At 5:59 a.m., German weapons opened fire. Tracer rounds walked across the water. Mortar rounds exploded, sending up geysers. The surface of the flooded field became a chaos of impacts, splashes, and screaming metal. Americans fell. The water turned red. Standard doctrine predicted the attack would collapse. The paratroopers kept coming. Those still able to move continued forward, firing their rifles from shoulder height, keeping weapons above water. Some were swimming. Others used dead comrades as cover. A few were crawling through water less than 2 feet deep, pulling themselves forward with their elbows. They reached the shore. At 6:04 a.m., 42 American paratroopers made it to German positions. Hand-to-hand fighting began immediately. Germans had defensive positions and numerical advantage. The Americans had momentum and fury. Hartmann's second company held, but barely. They killed 30 Americans. 12 reached the village. But those 12 Americans didn't retreat. They took positions in stone buildings and became a cancer inside Hartmann's defensive perimeter, tying down an entire platoon. And more Americans were coming from different directions. This wasn't an attack. It was infiltration by violence. 6:19 a.m. Before Hartmann could reorganize his forces after the Western attack, his southern defenses reported contact. American infantry, estimated battalion strength, advancing in open formation across the fields. They're not using cover. They're just walking toward us, firing from the hip. It's like they don't care about machine guns. Hartmann ran to the southern observation post. It was worse than reported. Through his binoculars, Hartmann saw approximately 300 American paratroopers advancing across open farmland. No trenches, no tank support, no artillery preparation. They were simply walking forward in extended lines, rifles firing, bayonets fixed, like an 18th century infantry assault. Wehrmacht doctrine had no procedure for this. You didn't need doctrine, you just fired until they stopped. All machine guns, continuous fire, mortars, rapid fire on the advancing forces. Don't stop shooting until they're gone. German defensive fire was devastating. MG-42 machine guns could fire 1,200 rounds per minute. Hartmann's battalion had 9 machine guns covering the southern approach. That was 10,800 rounds per minute hitting a target area 300 meters wide. Americans fell in clusters. Entire squads disappeared in the first minute of fire. The assault line wavered, thinned, bent under the weight of metal. It didn't break. The paratroopers kept advancing. Some fell and got back up. Others crawled forward after being hit. Squad leaders were everywhere, visible because they were standing upright, walking calmly through fire, directing their men. At 6:27 a.m., the first Americans reached German positions. They'd crossed 400 meters of open ground under continuous machine gun fire. Approximately 150 had made it. That was enough. German positions collapsed in sections. The Americans didn't fight for territory. They fought to kill. Hartmann watched his carefully constructed defensive line dissolve into a series of isolated close-quarters battles. By 6:34 a.m., Hartmann's southern defenses had ceased to exist as a cohesive line. His troops were fighting in small groups, surrounded, being pushed back toward the village center. The Americans had advanced 400 meters in 15 minutes against prepared defenses. Across open ground, Hartmann tried to organize a counterattack. Before he could issue orders, his eastern positions reported contact. More Americans, attacking through hedgerows. They were being hit from 3 directions simultaneously. This wasn't chaos, this was coordinated. Multiple isolated groups, acting independently, achieving the same objective. 6:41 a.m. Hartmann's command post, a stone farmhouse in the village center, came under direct fire, not random fire, aimed fire. Someone was targeting command and control specifically. His radio operator took a round through the neck. The battalion's executive officer was hit seconds later. Hartmann grabbed the radio himself, trying to coordinate forces that were already fragmenting. All units, fall back to secondary positions. We're being overrun. The radio went dead. Artillery? No. Americans were cutting telephone lines, destroying radio antennas, eliminating communication networks with disturbing precision. Hartmann made the decision every German officer dreaded: withdraw before being surrounded. The 352nd Infantry Division couldn't lose an entire battalion to hold one village. They needed to preserve combat power for the larger battle. Prepare to withdraw north, he ordered remaining officers. Leapfrog by companies. First company covers, second withdraws, reverse. Standard withdrawal procedure against a superior force. The withdrawal began at 6:48 a.m. First company established covering positions, while second company pulled back through the village. It should have been orderly. The Americans didn't allow it to be orderly. As soon as German forces began moving, American fire intensified. Paratroopers who'd been using cover suddenly stood and charged. They didn't try to prevent the withdrawal. They tried to turn it into a rout. Hartmann's men fought as they retreated, maintaining discipline under conditions that would have broken many units. But the Americans pursued with a ferocity that seemed inhuman. They followed so closely that German covering forces couldn't establish proper firing lines without hitting their own troops. At 7:03 a.m., a German machine gun crew turned to provide cover fire. Before they could set up, American paratroopers were on them, apparently having sprinted 200 meters through open ground to close the distance before the gun could fire. The crew fought with rifles and entrenching tools. They died fighting. By 7:15 a.m., Hartmann's battalion had withdrawn 1 kilometer north of Saint-Côme-du-Mont. They'd preserved most of their force. The Americans occupied the village. Casualty count: 117 German soldiers dead or seriously wounded. Hartmann had lost 30% of his battalion in 90 minutes. American casualties were higher. Estimated 200 killed or wounded from the multiple assaults. In any rational military calculation, the Americans had lost. But they held the village. They'd accomplished their mission. They'd driven a veteran German battalion from prepared positions. That wasn't supposed to be possible. 8 a.m. Hartmann established a new defensive line 3 kilometers north of Saint-Côme-du-Mont. His troops were exhausted, bloodied, shaken in ways that Eastern Front combat hadn't prepared them for. Hauptmann Richter approached, field dressing on his left arm, face streaked with smoke and dirt. "They fight like demons," he said quietly. "Not like soldiers, like demons." Hartmann nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing. German soldiers fought for territory, objectives, orders. They retreated when necessary, surrendered when surrounded, used tactics that made military sense. American paratroopers fought differently. They fought as if death was acceptable, surrender was impossible, and retreat was unthinkable. Every isolated group became a weapon pointed at the nearest German position. "How many did we kill?" Hartmann asked. "Estimates suggest 200, maybe more." "And they still took the village." Richter was silent for a moment. Then, "Oberst, I've fought Russians. I've fought British. I've fought Americans in North Africa. These airborne troops, "They're not like anything I've encountered. The Russians fight with numbers. The British fight with discipline. Regular Americans fight with equipment. And the paratroopers? They fight like they're already dead and just haven't realized it yet." The battalion spent June 8th reorganizing positions and treating wounded. Hartmann compiled his after-action report that evening, choosing his words carefully. Wehrmacht regulations required objective assessment of enemy capabilities. Personal opinions were discouraged. But Hartmann's report contained both facts and conclusion that would later appear in German intelligence documents. American 101st Airborne Division demonstrates combat effectiveness far exceeding standard American infantry units. Key observations: isolated groups do not attempt to consolidate or evade. They attack toward enemy positions immediately. Numerical disadvantage does not deter assault operations. Observe 12 paratroopers attacking 43 defenders in fortified position. Casualty rates that would cause standard units to break contact instead intensify aggression. Command structure appears decentralized. Small unit leaders operate independently with high initiative. Surrender appears contrary to unit culture. Wounded paratroopers observed continuing to fight when capture was inevitable. Recommendation: these forces should be classified as elite assault troops, not standard infantry. Engagement requires different tactical approach than used against regular American divisions. Static defense insufficient. Mobile reserves essential. Expect attacks from unexpected directions at unexpected times. Tactical assessment: American airborne operations create chaos intentionally. The scattered drops that appeared to be failure are actually their tactical method. Every isolated group becomes an independent attack element. Attempting to defend everywhere against such forces is futile. They will find gaps and exploit them regardless of defensive preparations. Division headquarters received the report at 10 p.m. The operations officer filed it with 14 other reports from units that had engaged American airborne forces on June 6 through 8. Every report said essentially the same thing: these Americans fight differently. Wehrmacht High Command would eventually aggregate these reports into intelligence assessments, classifying US Airborne divisions among the most dangerous enemy forces in Western Europe, rated higher than standard American divisions, comparable to British commandos and Soviet Guards units in combat effectiveness. But that analysis would come weeks later, after many more German officers had learned what Hartmann discovered on June 8. American paratroopers didn't fight like soldiers defending territory. They fought like demons hunting Germans. Throughout June 1944, reports from German units across Normandy described similar encounters. The pattern was consistent: 82nd Airborne Division at Sainte-Mère-Église. German counterattack with armor support met with American paratroopers who destroyed tanks using satchel charges at point-blank range. Units that should have withdrawn instead held positions against mechanized forces. 101st Airborne at Carentan. Wehrmacht forces attempted to recapture the town with 2 regiments. American paratroopers fought from positions inside burning buildings, continued engaging German forces while wounded, refused to surrender even when ammunition was exhausted. 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment report: American airborne troops demonstrate fanaticism comparable to Waffen-SS. Difference: SS soldiers fight for ideology. Americans appear to fight for each other. Result is same: they do not break. By mid-June, Wehrmacht tactical doctrine for engaging U.S. airborne forces had evolved. Do not expect standard infantry behavior. Do not assume numerical advantage. Guarantee success. Do not treat isolated groups as weakened forces. Do commit overwhelming force immediately. Do expect attacks from unexpected directions. Do maintain mobile reserves for rapid response. German artillery officers learned to pre-register defensive fires around known American positions, not to prevent attacks, but to limit their depth. Infantry commanders learned to attack American positions only with substantial numerical superiority and armor support. One example of adaptation came from Hauptmann Wilhelm Weber, commanding a company in the 91st Luftlandedivision Division. After losing a platoon to 15 isolated American paratroopers, Weber changed tactics entirely. When scouts reported American forces occupying a farmhouse, Weber didn't assault it. He surrounded it with 3 companies, brought up anti-tank guns and artillery, and demanded surrender. The Americans refused. Weber spent 6 hours reducing the position with artillery and heavy weapons before committing infantry. When German troops finally entered the farmhouse, they found 8 American bodies. The paratroopers had held off 300 Germans for 6 hours with ammunition they'd scavenged from dead comrades. Weber's after-action report concluded, American airborne forces cannot be defeated with standard infantry tactics. They must be destroyed with overwhelming firepower from standoff range. Close combat always favors them, regardless of numbers. Something else happened in those weeks that German officers didn't report officially, but discussed privately. Respect. Fighting the Americans became different after encountering airborne forces. Wehrmacht soldiers who'd previously dismissed American combat capability learned to fear the red and white Screaming Eagle patch of the 101 and the white AA of the 82nd. Captured German documents from July 1944 show intelligence officers tracking airborne unit locations with the same attention given to British commando forces or Soviet Guards divisions. Maps marked American airborne positions in red, the color reserved for highest threat enemy units. German soldiers began sharing stories about the paratroopers, not propaganda, actual accounts. The 12 Americans who took Myers farmhouse, the company that crossed flooded fields under machine gun fire, the wounded paratroopers who kept fighting. The stories spread through Wehrmacht units faster than official intelligence reports. And with the stories came a grim realization. These Americans weren't soft, materialistic conscripts fighting for pay. They were volunteers who'd chosen to jump from airplanes into enemy territory with minimal support and maximum danger. They were, in the words of one German veteran, what we thought SS soldiers were supposed to be. December 22, 1944, Hartmann's war brought him back to face American airborne forces. The 352nd Infantry Division had been rebuilt after Normandy losses and transferred to the Ardennes for Hitler's winter offensive. Hartmann now commanded what remained of the division after 6 months of grinding combat, approximately 2,000 men of the original 15,000. They were part of the forces encircling Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was trapped. When Hartmann learned which American unit held the town, he felt something close to dread. Not fear of combat, he'd survived the Eastern Front and Normandy. Dread at what would be required to defeat them. The encirclement was complete. No supplies were reaching the Americans. Artillery pounded their positions constantly. German forces held every road, every approach. Wehrmacht intelligence estimated the surrounded troops had 3 days of ammunition and medical supplies. Standard military doctrine predicted surrender within a week. Hartmann knew better. On December 22nd, German forces offered surrender terms. The American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, replied with one word: nuts. The siege continued. For days, German forces tried to break the perimeter. Every attack met the same response Hartmann had encountered in Normandy: American paratroopers who fought harder when surrounded, who refused to consider surrender, who turned desperation into aggression. On December 26th, American armor broke through German lines and relieved Bastogne. The 101st Airborne had held for 7 days with minimal supplies and ammunition against overwhelming German forces in freezing weather. Hartmann's division withdrew east, having lost another 800 men trying to reduce one encircled town. That night, alone in his command post, Hartmann wrote in his personal diary, "The Americans have created something extraordinary with their airborne divisions. They take volunteers, train them to absurd standards, and create soldiers who fight as if survival is secondary to mission. The regular Wehrmacht soldier fights well when supported. The American paratrooper fights best when alone and surrounded. This is their advantage." Fritz Hartmann survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in May 1945, spent 2 years in a POW camp in France, and returned to Germany in 1947. He never commanded troops again. He worked as a factory manager in Bremen until retirement in 1973, married, raised 2 children, and rarely discussed the war publicly. But in private journals discovered after his death in 1989, Hartmann documented his evolving assessment of American airborne forces with analytical precision. June 1944. These troops fight with fanaticism that seems irrational. They attack when surrounded and refuse surrender when defeat is inevitable. This contradicts everything I learned about American character. August 1944. Have concluded American airborne forces represent a different military culture than regular U.S. divisions. They are volunteers who choose the most dangerous assignments. This self-selection creates units with unusual psychological profile. December 1944. Bastogne confirmed my assessment. Surrounded, outnumbered, low on ammunition, they attacked us. Standard military logic says isolated forces become defensive. American paratroopers become offensive. April 1945. Reflecting on 3 years fighting Americans, British, Russians. Each has strengths. Russians, limitless manpower and material. British, discipline and tactical skill. Americans, industrial capacity and firepower. But American airborne possesses something different. They want to fight, not because of ideology or compulsion, because they chose this. That choice makes them extremely dangerous. His final entry, written in 1982 while reading a history of the 101st Airborne, was remarkably candid. Wehrmacht intelligence assessed American soldiers as inferior fighters before D-Day. We were catastrophically wrong about their airborne forces. They fought with intensity we associated with our best SS formations, but without the ideology. They fought for each other and their mission. In retrospect, I understand why they were so effective. We trained soldiers to follow orders and execute doctrine. Americans trained paratroopers to think independently and accomplish objectives regardless of circumstances. When command structure collapsed, as it always does in combat, our soldiers waited for orders. Their paratroopers attacked. The scattered D-Day drops that looked like disaster were actually their greatest tactical advantage. Every isolated group became a weapon. We couldn't defend everywhere. They exploited that inherent weakness. If I could give one lesson to future officers, never underestimate an enemy who volunteers for danger. They chose to be there. That choice is a force multiplier doctrine cannot quantify. This is the story German officers didn't discuss publicly. The uncomfortable truth that American airborne forces fundamentally challenged Wehrmacht assumptions about combat effectiveness and national character. Oberst Fritz Hartmann learned on June 7, 1944, what thousands of German soldiers would discover throughout the war. American paratroopers fought differently. Not better or worse by conventional metrics, but with an intensity and aggression that contradicted every intelligence assessment. 12 rounds of ammunition, 18 paratroopers. 83 Germans dead in 36 hours of combat across Normandy. If this story gave you new perspective on World War II combat, please like and subscribe. Comment below. What other Wehrmacht assessments of Allied forces should we examine? Thank you for watching.